The Russian armed forces made several advances across the eastern and northern flank of Mirnorod over the past 24 hours, where they've managed to storm and capture several fortified positions, entrenched positions of the Ukrainian armed forces, and to gain a foothold within the town of Balahan. The Russian forces continue their offensive operations along the thinner river line here to the east of Balahan, capturing the forest patch areas as well as the northern residential areas of the town. This allows the Russians to gain their first foothold within the settlements east of Mirnorod, just outside the city. The Russians are here threatening the Ukrainian positions following capture of several fortifications along the northern flank of Rodivka, where they've managed to gain control over the Hourglass Formation and the forested fortification areas, including the industrial area and the fortifications along the road from Rodivka to Mirnorod. This allows the Russians to have secure control over the road between Rodivka to Novoekonomishne, where they're now operating to the west of this, which allows for additional supply lines leading up to Novoekonomishne for offensive operations in the Mirnorod section of the front line. The Russians are here storming the settlements outside of Mirnorod to gain control over the outskirts of the settlement before starting to storm the city itself. Mirnorod is a very interesting city because on the outskirts of it there are several apartment complex areas which are comparable to the Shakhtarsky district, not in terms of fortifications, but simply on the fact that the apartment complex areas are on the outskirts of the city, which allows them to overlook the open fields outside of it. There's this narrow area in between the northern and southern parts of Mirnorod, which is also an additional apartment complex area that is very wide. Then at the southern outskirts there are additional apartment complex buildings, but not any significant presence. There's also the railway station, which has some industrial areas. Therefore, the Russians are likely looking to gain a foothold within the industrial area in the southern parts of Mirnorod by capturing the settlements on the outskirts of it and gain control over the industrial area as a base of operations for the fighting within Mirnorod. While any fighting from the south to the north of Mirnorod would be difficult due to the apartment complex area in the central parts in the narrow passage, which acts as a choke point for the Russian forces are wanting to pass through, not to mention the fortifications within it that have been prepared. So the Ukrainians have this as a stable choke point that the Russians will have a difficult time passing through. Instead, what we are likely to see is that the Russians will be operating in the southern and northern parts independently. Based on the recent advances, the Russians have not just captured the northern parts of Rodivka, allowing for secure passage from Rodivka to Novoekonomishne on the western bank of the Kaseny-Turets river line, but they've also managed to make a small advance to the north of Mirnorod, which is one of many that have happened over the past few months, where the Russians are doing positional fighting on the northern flank of the city. Russians are here clearing their way through the fortifications and defensive lines to operate within the northern parts, where we again see apartment complex areas in the outskirts of the city. The Russians have a difficult time gaining a foothold within it because of the apartment complex areas that cover the southern, eastern, and northern flanks in these three separate areas. Not to mention the central parts of the city, where we see a large industrial area along the railway line. This, in combination with the apartment complex areas that are spread sporadically through the city itself, the Russians have a difficult time getting access to it. Therefore, the Russians have been prioritizing Pokrovsk, where they can focus on the apartment complex area, storming them, gaining control of them, and cutting off the E50 highway to the west and the Rudenske-Pokrovsk highway to the north, which will cut off all supply lines leading into Mirnorod, and the Russians can capture the city by bypassing it entirely. In an effort towards that, the Russians have restarted storming Rudenske to gain control over the city, which overlooks the northern highway. Gain control over this for the Russians will allow them to operate along the intersection here further south, which connects Ryshina to the Rudenske-Pokrovsk highway. It also allow the Russians to start storming the city from the northern flank and gain control over these farm areas, which can act as outposts along the supply lines. From this, we can see that the Russians would have a significant advantage if they manage to capture Rudinske, but for a capture of Rudinske, they need to secure the supply lines, which they now have by recapturing the positions west of Voikivka, recapturing Nikonorivka and Doroshne, which secures the northern flank of Rudinske and the southern flank of the Russian forces operating within Vilna, Kozyrev Yar, and the areas here in the north. And with the recent capture of Volodymyrivka as well, they have the river line itself as a natural barrier, and they're even operating on the northern bank of it towards Shekhove. From this, Russians are securing their supply lines on the northern flank, which lifts the burden of the southern flank having to resupply all of the forces in the entire northern flank of Pokrovsk, and it can instead focus entirely on resupplying the Rudinske direction to strengthen the offensive capabilities of the Russian forces in the area. The general rule is the more logistical hubs you have, the more supply lines that lead to these logistical hubs that then connects to the front line, the larger concentrations of forces you're able to concentrate without having to worry about combining a lot of forces in a single area, which makes them vulnerable to long-range strikes, whether MLRS or a lot of drones, artillery, and so on. This means that the more logistical hubs Russians have control of and the more supply lines that lead to the front line from those logistical hubs, the more powerful the Russian offensive operations become, the more operations they can launch, and the quicker they capture these positions. This is what we're seeing in Pokrovsk, where the initial advances were extremely slow. The more logistical hubs they captured, the faster these advances became, and now they have control over the majority of the Shakhtarsky district. Although some of these updates come in sudden spurs, that is due to the fact that there is a gap in the information. Most of the information we receive is either through geolocated footage, where either side of the combating forces release footage of an AFU drone strike, which is then geolocated to be somewhere along the front line, or when troops come out of rotation and report the recent updates. Therefore, if no drone footage comes out, then it can usually take days up to weeks before an update takes place. This usually means that the updates are larger and wider to catch up all of the progress that has been made over the weeks it has taken since the last update. Further north, the Russians, with the recapture of the southern flank of Nikonorivka and the western flank of Voikivka, completely secures additional supply lines that lead up to Nikonorivka, from which they can launch offensive operations in the western direction towards Doroshne, Ivanivka, and Novoshakhove. It also allows for additional supply lines going up north towards Vilna and Kozyrev Yar. The Russian objective would be to capture Novoshakhove and Ivanivka on the northern flank of Doroshne, which secures the northern flank of Doroshne and additional supply lines going further north, from where they can operate either in the direction of Dobropilya itself, the highway between Dobropilya and Kramatorsk, or the flank of Toretsk and Shakhove, or all three if they have enough supply lines leading up to the front. This will also allow them to flank the southern direction towards the Dobropilya-Rudinske highway and infiltrate the northwestern flank of Pokrovsk in the direction of Reshene to cut off the northern highways and roads that then connects Pokrovsk further south. This is to bypass fortifications facing in the southern direction. Rather than capturing Rudinske and moving in between two defensive lines, they can bypass all of these defensive lines by pushing through Doroshne down towards Belitske, which is another city with approximately 10,000 pre-war population, along the highway, gaining control of which can act as a logistical hub for offensive operations going in the southern and western directions, bypassing the fortifications by flanking them from the rear and threatening the supply lines leading into Reshene, from which the main supplies goes through these days for the resupply of Pokrovsk and Mirnorad in this section of the front line. On the wider front, additional advances have taken place, where the Russians have managed to advance in the southeastern outskirts, gaining a foothold within Poltavka from a river crossing from the eastern direction. The Russians are working on gaining full control of Poltavka, where fighting is taking place from the southern outskirts to the central parts of Poltavka, and positional fighting is also taking place over the final remaining residential area on the eastern bank of the Yanchur River. As for the northern section of the front line, additional advances have also taken place, where the Russians have managed to capture significant developments within Vovchansk, where they've managed to gain control over the residential area connecting the first patch area to the central parts where recent advances have taken place. also the southern outskirts of the northern bank of the Vovcha River line, and the residential area between the eastern and western parts. From this, we can see that the Russians have flattened the front line from the forest patch area to the Vovcha River line, as the Russians slowly push through to gain full control over Vovchansk. The Russians are now in a position where they have a very significant foothold within the southern parts of Vovchansk. It will be difficult for the Ukrainians to push them out across the Vovcha River line, back across it, following the foothold gained and the apartment buildings captured. From this, the Russians are now just a few steps from reaching the central parts, the railway station, here in the southern parts of Vovchansk, which includes apartment complex buildings, the railway station, and additional industrial areas, farm areas, which all will allow the Russians to have a significant control over the area. If the Russians capture the railway parts here in the southern outskirts of Vovchansk, then the remaining Ukrainian positions within it will be unable to hold back the Russian forces from gaining full control over Vovchansk, which will start a different phase of the fighting here in the Kharkiv region. The Russians are able to fully control Vovchansk, and with proper supply lines towards the southern parts of the town, the Russians can expand in the eastern, western, and southern directions with offensive operations to not just secure Vovchansk, but also the vicinity, allowing them to operate within the section of the front line in a much wider area. And with the recent advances across the border area between the Belgorod and Kharkiv region, and across the Uskar River line in the direction of the Varishna and Kupiansk, it's only a matter of time before the Russians launch an operation to connect the three sectors from Vovchansk in the northwest, Milove in the east, and the Varishna and Kupiansk in the southeast, getting control over a wide section of the border area with proper highways connecting the three sides, allowing the Russians to make significant offensive operations here within the Kharkiv region. This is to negate some of the advances the Ukrainians made during the Kharkiv offensive in 2022. However, I also believe that the Russians are currently holding back from launching large operations in other sectors of the front line as long as the siege of Minrat and Pokrovsk is ongoing. This is to force the Ukrainians to redirect their forces to that section of the front line. The reason for this is the Russians are operationally encircling the city. That means they have a significant advantage with the fighting within the area, as the more Ukrainian forces are being sent to the cities and the more supplies goes into the area, the more losses the Ukrainians will be taking during this advantageous position of the Russians. That means that the Russians are currently working on Pokrovsk and Mirnorat to weaken the Ukrainian forces as much as possible. If they gain full control of it, I believe additional offensive operations will happen both in the Kharkiv, Sumy, Uskar River line, and a Siversk section of the front line, where the Russians will start the siege of the Sloviansk-Shentinivka line by flanking them from the rear and from the northern flank, with additional offensive operations in the Zaporizhia region along the defensive lines and in the northern section of the front line to widen the front line. All of these will add up to the Ukrainian forces being spread thinly across the front line, with the Russians gaining control over new logistical hubs, which can operate a significant amount of forces on the Russian side. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.